Welcome to the Three Brothers Quest. In the 3BQ room today, we have the brothers themselves, Ian and Michael and Philip Baldwin, here to explore the Axial Age. Gentlemen, welcome.
Be here.
Hello, Rob.
Nice
Nice
to
to
be
be
You want? I'll start off. This presentation or discussion was a brainchild of Brother Philip's, and I think Michael and I hopped on board. I'm not sure why Mikey did, but I hopped on board because the thesis, which is that our civilization, our global civilization today, which is evolving, rests on events that took place in the first millennium BCE, before Christ era, Christian era. And the person who coined that idea of an axial age was a German philosopher named Karl Jaspers, who came up with it after the Second World War. He was not obviously, but he was a humanist. And I think he was deeply moved to say, well, how do we recover ourselves? How do we recover our humanity? What is our humanity? And he wrote a book called The Origin and Goal of History. And early on in that book, he has a chapter called The Axial Age. This is the book. I know I'm not supposed to do too much of that, but it's available. It's not obscurely written. Jaspers, as far as I'm able to tell, he didn't get a lot of play right away. It's only in our emerging global age that Jaspers has come up into the fore, and over the last 30 to 40 years gotten some serious play. So when was it? I think pretty common consent, it was between 800 and 200 BC. So 600 years. The middle three, 600 to 300, were the most pivotal, where the great leaders of four, not great leaders, great thinkers, thought leaders, put it that way. And they're not just thinkers, they're questers for meaning. And I say that because one of the characteristics of the age was universal suffering, and the suffering in the form of internecine wars. The age is located not all over the world. We didn't know then things that we know now about, say, the Incas or the pre-Incas, the Peruvian ancient civilization. So it's confined to four, and if you count a little more accurately, it's really three: India, China, and what we now call the West, and so did Jaspers. The West standing on Greece and Israel, the Old Testament, the Bible, which traditions are treated separately. So he tracks all of that. And in recently, I think it's 2018, the great independent scholar of religions, Karen Armstrong, wrote this book, published this book fairly recently, called The Great transformation. And I think since none of us is a scholar or expert on the field, we're just, it's holed up in our minds as an extraordinarily important period in history. We have relied on Karen Armstrong's presentation to quite a considerable degree. So it's not an easy book to follow because she tracks 4, jumps a century, tracks 4, jumps another. So you really need to keep your wits about you to follow her in everything she says. Jaspers makes the point that, yeah, there were prior civilizations that had a certain amount of simultaneity in them. Today we throw in the Peruvian civilization, but when he wrote the Sumerian, the Egyptian, and then the Indus civilizations. But he said their simultaneity doesn't hold a candle to the simultaneity of the great, what I'll shortcut and call the great religions / philosophies that exemplify the Axial Age. So how to talk about it? Because I don't want to take up too much time, but to give you an example so people can concretize this a little bit better, Zoroaster, who is not part of Karen Armstrong's book, not much of a part, which comes out of Persia. Zoroaster is a real character. He lived from 618 to 541. So that, in other words, he's born in the 7th century, but he really holds forth in the 6th. Confucius is born in 551, so he's born in the 6th century and holds forth in 2 centuries over the course of those 2 centuries. The Buddha was born in 563 and taught, for 50 years. Those 3 civilizations are, in a way, you can focus your attention on these 3 avatar thinkers. When you move over to Greece, you've got to look at a lot of different people. Plato might come first to mind, but Armstrong makes clear that revolutionary thinkers came before Plato in the form of Greece's dramatists, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and finally Euripides, who was more of a contemporary of Plato's. Possibly Plato's teacher, he had a teacher, Socrates, fits in as the avatar that kicks it off for Greece. Even more complicated is the Old Testament civilization, which is really 2, you might call them today, kingdoms. One being Judah, the southern kingdom, and the other being Israel, the northern kingdom. And they did not see eye to eye on a lot of things. They did, of course, see eye to eye on many things, but they each had different emphases and traditions, and they were geographically separate, and they suffered in many ways different fates until the final seizure and disposition of Jerusalem with the complete destruction of the temple in the early 6th century. So that was a formative series of events for the Hebrew psychology and practice. So they're all very complicated. Of course, in China, until I read these books, I always thought of Lao Tzu or Lao Zi. I think the Lao Zi is not a good. Yeah, I'm going to stick to Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu. I'm going to stick to the old pronunciation. When I grew up in the 50s reading this, Lao Tzu preceded Confucius, and the birth date given to him in the texts I read was 604, not to get technical. He's now been demoted to someone who comes after Confucius, and all the stories about them apparently are apocryphal. All right, well, that's enough of that. I jotted down just now some of the things that mark the age. In reaction to the extreme violence of the times, whole villages would be wiped out. Man, woman, children. The numbers could be extraordinary.
Yeah.
When Greece confronted Persia, Persia had an army of 100,000. Now we tend to think, or I tend to think, oh, those numbers didn't happen until the 20th century. They were real numbers even back then. So in reaction to those 4 local environments, widespread apart, was to how do we make sense of this? I think this is what was the cataclysmic point for individual thinkers. How do we make sense of this? This is our gods. These are our gods protecting us. And they were thrown back on themselves to sort it. And for whatever reason, in that first millennium, they had the psychological potential to use reason to try and reason it out, to try and self-reflect and to dig in, not out, in. So you had this growth of self-awareness and the development of word pity is not used, but it's an old Greek word or concept. And I actually think it is an antecedent to the more common compassion. So compassion we all know and relate to, but if you look at the Greeks, they experienced pity in those momentous dramas of Aeschylus and Sophocles. So pity, compassion, self-awareness, especially in India, but also I think according to Armstrong, in all 4 civilizations, nonviolence, or what the Indians called ahimsa. It was confined differentially, but at its broadest extent, which you see with what's his name, the founder of Jainism, Ayurveda. I've forgotten his name, Mahaveda. Anyway, the sense of compassion is extended beyond humans to animals, plants, beetles, mosquitoes, everything. It was radical. You don't get something like this in either China or the West. But overall, it's an expression of this reaction of compassion. It's brilliantly described by Armstrong when she talks about the tragedians and how after the victory over the Persians, when the Persians had destroyed Athens, but the leader of Athens said, "Get out of town. We're going to let them have it." And they took it within years. This is as if in America in the 50s, we did a great drama, Hollywood, showing the Germans and Hitler in a way that enabled everyone to weep. That didn't happen. But I'm just saying that happened in Greece. I had no idea of it, and I was quite impressed. So the other thing is, of course, primary to, I think, all the traditions, but is the possibility of self-knowledge. And no one that I've read about the Axial Age goes into the idea of the individual so much, but the idea of the individual and his or her responsibility in the scale and scheme of things had to come up, because the individual is a supreme referent in this age. I mean, the Buddha said it very clearly. Don't listen to me. Listen to yourself. Test it in your own mind. I don't want you to follow me. Test what I have to say in your own mind. Socrates, of course, had a different approach that was equally perhaps radical. And I think that is what marks this period as a period of great interest to all of us and great relevance to where we are today. I'm going to add something that isn't in the people I've read, which is that I think the Axial Age continued, you might say, differentially in the arrival of Christianity, and definitely in Arabia with the arrival of Islam. So if you fix your mind more on the processes versus the locales, that becomes a more entertainable notion. The Arabs were very isolated. They, I forget, but long ago I read a biography of Muhammad. He was a trader, a merchant in Mecca, I believe, not Medina, in Mecca. And he was envious and discoursed all the time with Jewish traders, Hebrew traders, and said, you guys you got a leg up on us with your God and your philosophy and religion. And that was a great deal of his motivation hundreds of years later. So I would broaden the idea to get out of time and space to some degrees, but that's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about.
Well, that was terrific. That was a tour de force. And I think what I would add at this point would be to try to take all you've said and place it on the big table of what is the story that we're sort of investigating, we fellas, about the whole sweep of human history, and with a view towards, if we can understand better where we're coming from, we may be able to improve a bit on what we're doing and where we're going. I think that's part of the underlying premise of our project. And we, I think I'm correct, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I think basically the sort of the nugget of the Axial Age is quite recent to our conscious awareness. It was sort of a big aha. Of course, everybody knows about Confucius and Taoism and the Buddha and the Hindus and Judaism and the Greeks. It's all out there. But to package it as a sort of special transitional moment And a few centuries, 3, 4, 5, 6 centuries, is a comparatively short period of time. And it's fascinating that the word axial, of course, is very appropriate because, in effect, you can argue, I believe, that all of civilization, all of human history, prior to this period, fell into a different mindset. It's not this or that. These things are always evolutionary and evolving. But you might say that prior to this whole phenomenon that Ian has described, most of humanity was rooted in shamanic traditions and very much rooted in mythological traditions, very much connected to the cosmos. And this axial age sort of was a doorway, a portal through which that very, very long tradition of human experience, which, depending on your perspective, you can say it was going on for 50,000 years or 300,000 years. Anatomical humans are now known to have been around for over 300,000 years. You can argue that we passed through a portal in this age that Ian has described. And prior to getting on to the subject of the axial age, we became very much fascinated by the phenomenon of precession and the role that precession refers to an astronomical phenomenon of the manner in which the Earth travels through the solar system and through which the universe is observed by human beings. And a famous pair of, I think today we would say, astromythologists, is that the word? There's actually a field for it. A very controversial and complicated and difficult book called Hamlet's Mill, written by Giorgio de Santillana and Herta von Deschen back in the 60s, which attempted to link worldwide mythology with this phenomenon of precession. And it was a controversial book, and it remains a controversial book, but there's ever increasing evidence that it's pretty clear that societies worldwide were fundamentally hooked up both spiritually and in their everyday life with the manner in which the Earth passes through the different signs of the zodiac. And we could say this was archaic civilization, and certainly mythologically based civilization, spiritually, religiously, whatever you like. And then you come to what Ian has described, and you have this enormous shift, which I think it's fair to say largely defines the succeeding 22,000 years of human history, which is, for all intents and purposes, the modern era. Now, why we think this is so fascinating, I think it's self-evident with this portal that we went through during those centuries was a profound evolution from what had come before. And of course, within those great traditions, for simplicity's sake, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and the philosophical tradition of the Greeks, there are some defining elements that are important for us to discuss, and which I think maybe in the rest of the time here we might talk about this a little bit, because the Greeks, from the perspective of so-called modern Western society, they posited the most, based on the results, flash forward 2,000 years, the most dramatic shift in perspective. And I think I'll give you this example because it's so sort of dramatic. There's a fantastic book by a man named Jeremy Nadler called In the Shadow of the Machine. And he traces, in effect, it's an incredibly, I couldn't recommend the book more. It's an incredibly detailed and thoughtful history of technology. And he talks early in the book about water mills as and representative of extraordinary technological developments that took place at the time of the Greeks. And Archimedes thought up all sorts of stuff, a lot more than that lever. I find Archimedes' lever is a fabulous symbol for all sorts of things. I'm always saying to my assistants in our studio, don't forget Archimedes, as I go about insisting on doing everything by myself, because I use his lever. But water mills were invented at that time, along with a lot of other technological innovations, as a theoretical exercise. Their practical application wasn't very important. There were water mills. The Romans embraced the water mill, but in all this time, 2,000 years, we've discovered 56 sites, evidence of water mills. Their relationship to the water mill was ambivalent. It really took another 1,000 years for the water mill to kick in full bore. Why is that? Because people were still, in large measure, in the pre-axial age. They were into the mythology, these machines. It was more about the gods that were these machines represented than the actual practical application of these things. So the water mill is a marvelous example of moving from mythological, cosmologically based civilization into modern civilization. And dare I say it, we're not all entirely happy with modern civilization. And it behooves us to try to get a grip on it. And that comes back, of course, to the very important things Ian had to say, which all of these traditions shared, including the Greeks, around compassion. And we haven't yet mentioned transcendence and the way in which all these axial ideas relate to transcendence and so forth and so on. Anyway, I think that's enough for contextualizing what we have to say.
Well, I'll add a little observation, which gets back to, I think, one of our themes for this story, what struck me in reading Karen's unbelievable book is that you had this period of huge horror show, war, nonstop. And it somehow triggered this blossoming of these great thinkers, philosophers that Ian delved into. And of course, what I get so caught up in is, so why did none of it really take hold in a lasting way? Because you have to realize that while there were these brilliant moments and these extraordinary thinkers, I think actually a later thinker being Mohammed, who was really an enlightened human being, I've always understood the minute he died, it was all over as far as his instincts and his thinking and his mandates, etc. It was just finished to what we're dealing with today in that sector of the world or belief system of the world. And so I just I find myself somewhat mystified again by this reversion to cruelty and greed and control and manipulation and revenge, all these things that I think are really abundant today. And so I think part of our story is trying to sort of understand, why does this constantly happen when you get these avatars, as Ian says, of compassion or pity or empathy, and it gets lost. And it also made me think, and of course, one of the greatest recent avatars was Gandhi. And Gandhi was just a huge hero and absolutely venerated. And I don't think an Indian much today or anybody else in the world gives a hoot about Gandhi. I mean, there's the museum in Delhi, and that's about it. And so it also made me think a little bit about this interview with our hero, Graham Hancock, whom we adore, who had a 2-hour interview just a couple of weeks ago. And he went back and discussed in part the Göbekli Tepe, which we've also covered in our 3BQ with Graham. And of course, this extraordinary hunter-gatherer development that then, and we're going back, of course, to, 11,000 BC, which then in about 9,500 BC or whatever, was buried. Now, mind you, the burial alone was simply enormous work. And also understand that Göbekli Tepe is only a little section that has been unearthed. It's a vast plateau of additional stele and whatever, carvings, etc., etc. And as I understand it, of course, the whole point of Göbekli Tepe, when rediscovered, which it was in the 90s, is to point you back to another civilization pre-horrendous flood. And as I heard Graham in that interview, evidently that civilization was rather wonderfully peaceful and evidently kind and evidencing this extraordinary behavior that we have lost. Now, I don't know how that can be proved or shown, but it does make me wonder whether we ever going to have the capacity to get into a period led maybe by some other great thinkers or reverting to some of the ones we got, so that we have an existence that is just kinder. So, I don't know. So, I mean, I think the Axial Age is extraordinary, of course. And as Philip says, it's a portal and it's a wake up and it's a demonstration of qualities, etc., that we want to adhere to, but it's just so difficult. So, of course, my only little other thing is I wrote what I thought might be a little bit of a rap on the Axial Age. And I have to read it. I think what evolved through the sort of new thinking generated in the Axial Age has a lot to do with three things: a turn to transcendence, wherein truth, justice, nirvana matter more than immediate material desires; individual responsibility, wherein a meaningful life transformed from something given to something achieved through personal choices; ethical behavior, and critical thinking. And three, thinkers explored how to navigate profound suffering through self-reflection. That's it for me.
That was very good. Wow. Michael,
the question that hangs on my hook is the first one you asked, which is, all right, we had these three let's call them intellectual revolutions, 4, they all petered out as of the 3rd century BC. Well, why did they? And yet they all had, despite that, a profound effect on the next 2 millennia.
Yeah.
And that question is a haunting question. Why didn't they get traction that endured? Now, you're a Buddhist, you'll say, well, there are a lot of Buddhists now, and they're not, and so forth. There are a lot of Mohammedans, but the violence, cruelty, and whatnot keeps going on.
Yeah.
It's
Concepts remain, but the practice seems feeble.
yeah,
That's right.
something like that. Something like that. I mean, we're to go to Philip's thing. He didn't mention. You didn't mention, Philly, the precession was a intricately worked out clock, which didn't get understood until the 20th century.
Yeah.
Again, a body of knowledge existed and petered out about 12,000 years ago, lost.
Yeah.
The standard procedure is that it was Ptolemy, or they call it contemporary of Ptolemy's, that discovered precession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we know that's bullshit. So, yeah, and that's part of, I think, our context, as Philip was saying, our context goes back, well, at least 20 years. I'll never forget, Michael, since you were intimate friend of Tuchel Tundub's and who exemplified compassion better than anyone I've known. I once talked to him and asked him, how far do your traditions go in terms of cultural? Maybe, it's not, he was never really a dogmatic and assertive. Oh, maybe 1900, 19,000 years BC. So, it was like being amongst Mexicans and talking about UFOs. You think this is a big deal? It is funny, and the technology is funny. And what was the conundrum you posed, Philip, about the windmills? And it took 1,000 years. Yeah,
for the practicality of the thing to glom on.
Yeah.
And boy, did it glom on.
Yeah.
Yes, I think I always give the analogy for all kinds of things. I like the analogy of a river. The river doesn't stop and a new one start. The river bends, and history is a very bendy river. And this axial age was a big bend.
A big bend. That's good.
I like that.
We carry all that with us. Not very. Its best elements are a bit of a struggle. But these things also happen sort of popping up here and there. I mean, it's only in the 1920s that we discovered the Harappan civilization in the Indus River Valley. Now, it's considered today that the Aryans came down and that was the end of the Harappans. But Harappan culture, based on archaeological evidence, was a very egalitarian community. No big temples, no hierarchical representation, rather modern, laid out streets in a very egalitarian fashion. Well, that doesn't prove anything, but you do scratch your head and wonder. And meanwhile, the Aryans came down, and a lot of people believe that the seeds of Hinduism were spread through the Indian subcontinent, essentially through the manner in which the Harappans civilization lived, and spilled their story through the Aryans across India. And I'm sure there are other things like this.
I mean, to understand the West and to understand how the Copernican / Galileo / Bacon / Descartes / a whole other bunch of remarkable thinkers happened, it would not have happened without the antecedent of Greece. It was baked in to the
You have to wonder, of those four major things in the Axial Age, the roots of the one that, quote, took over, if we can say that Western thinking. I mean, China has totally embraced the Western way of thinking, technology. The Indians have totally embraced it. The Arabs have embraced it. And then we go right back to Plato and the articulation of rational thought. And why did that particular one of the four things become, the
culturally
triumphant, culturally dominant 2,000 years later?
I think it was as we've explained in some of our previous stuff. We're interested in studying things through the East, the West, quantum physics. Can't forget about indigenous peoples. They're so marginalized and they're so forgotten. And I have, even though we've done a couple of things on anthropology and indigenous peoples, but we just don't realize they've been for thousands of years, in a sense, consistent and fully understanding of the nature of reality. Not a hesitation, it seems to me. And we got to bring that always back into play.
Absolutely, Michael. Yes. And let's not forget all those scientists who go down to the Amazon and suss out all those cures. That, of course, fell upon them by
They
accident.
also suss out their consciousness, some of them.
Philip, you mentioned at the very beginning of your remarks the shamanic tradition. And Michael, as you invoke the importance of the indigenous perspective, points of view, I wonder if for future episodes of the Three Brothers Quest, if it might be helpful to tap into our fellow humans out there who are steeped in, one way or another, shamanic traditions. I'm thinking of, for example, Jeremy Narby.
Totally.
Who has done what I can see as maybe the best anthropological and historical work on the shamanic traditions that I know of. Yeah, it just seems important. And other thing, I'll maybe a question for us all, Philip. I love your notion of the axial age as a portal, and I almost hear you suggesting that it was the axial age, as Jeremy Nadler suggests, the axial age that brought us from the shamanic, pre-mechanistic, pre-machine, if you will, world into this world of the machine, or the shadow of the machine, as Jeremy Nadler says. And I never thought of the axial age that way before, but that's a very powerful notion, I think.
I like the notion of your notion, Philip, of a big bend in the river.
Yeah.
And hopefully we're hitting another big bend. If we're not, serious rapids.
As in Niagara Falls.
Michael, both Michael and Ian, you're deeply steeped in Tibetan Buddhism. And I've always thought, and I don't know where I have this notion, I think perhaps from Joseph Campbell, who always said, the famous anthropologist, and he always said, well, if I was backed into a corner and I had to pick up a religious practice, it would be Tibetan Buddhism. And I think it's fair to say Tibetan Buddhism is deeply steeped in shamanic traditions.
Oh, totally. And you have to understand the influence of the Bon, B-O-N, which is really an indigenous shamanic tradition. And of course, it always makes me, apropos Ian talking about the compassion for all things and trees and plants and animals, etc. You have to remember, even for certainly in Bon, but also in Tibetan Buddhism, as I always remember with the great Dodrupchen Rinpoche, people who was famous for his divinations, and somebody would go and say, I'm building a new house, Rinpoche. There is this big rock. Can I move it? No. Because the rock, too, is, well, alive.
Yes.
And when you go into that perception, when you go into that perspective and you realize how we are carrying on now,
No.
it's quite serious.
Well, as Ian, Ian, you've always said, so much of what we're about is understanding this crisis of spirituality, lack thereof. And I think that's really true.
Well, we need to. This is going to be a broken record, but I'll keep the needle in the groove. We really do need to locate and persuade two things: people who can articulate an indigenous version of the cosmos that at the same time is located in real time.
Yeah.
Meaning now.
Right.
And I know there are tons of people, a lot of them women, and we need to put our shoulders to that wheel.
Yeah. Yep.
Because I think one of you, I think Michael, made the point, they have been consistent, as best we can tell, about the cosmos and their place in it for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And I guess their quote unquote religion, when you scrape the rug or the surface of the ground, their religion is shamanism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Mircea Elad would be a guest if he were alive. But again,
I think we sort of have done a natural pause point. I think, Rob, this is a sort of a first and kind of an experiment, having the three of us.
Philip, I was just going to say, this has been so wonderful. This is the very first time the three brothers have combined together to hold forth on a topic of interest, independent of a special guest. And I have so enjoyed this conversation. I hope we can do this again very soon.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Very
Rob.
good.
See you again in the next one.
Adios.